Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Cropper here with Onar from Norway again. We're going to be discussing immigration as a value. And Ayn Rand defined a value as that which one acts to gain and or keep. And if immigration is valuable to us, I think that we could have a discussion about what we need to do to act to gain and or keep immigration, and therefore in what way is it a value. And that will take us to the question of virtue, of what is a virtue. And a virtue is that by virtue of which you gain and or keep a value. So what would bring us to gaining and or keeping immigration? So my proposal overall, I guess, is that certain actions would lead to the destruction of immigration. For example, too much immigration or immigration of the wrong kind. That would destroy immigration as a value for us. That would not be valuable to us. In what way is immigration a value? And therefore, what would be the virtues that would make it aid our lives? Immigration's a value in what way? So, there we go. There's our jumping off part. Onar, do you want to jump in and say anything? Should I keep rambling?
Well, I can just make a few comments here. One thing is that some astute objectivists might object that there can never be such a thing as too much immigration, because if there is too much of it, then it's no longer immigration, but an invasion. Like it changes character. So that might be a pedantic point. But to me, it's important to think of immigration as the name we give to a specific kind of phenomenon. And once you go outside the boundaries of that, it changes the character from immigration to something else.
Yeah, how do we define immigration, and at what point does it go past immigration? And so maybe they're going to say that they don't necessarily value immigration. What they value is open borders.
That's like, in my view, open borders would be like a rule-based or a rationalistic approach to immigration instead of seeing it in a context. So too much immigration might mean, like if you change that to too many specific kinds of people crossing the border, that's different from saying too much immigration. Like the people who are now crossing the borders are sometimes referred to as illegal immigrants. But is that actually an immigration when you're crossing the border illegally? Like, I think it's worth having that discussion.
In extremely large numbers?
Well, even if it's just a single person crossing the border illegally, is that immigration? Sneaking into the country?
Right. Breaking the laws. Does that qualify as immigration? Yeah.
I'm just asking the question. I don't have an answer for it, but I think it's worth raising that, because we're used to just accepting the words and concepts that the left give us. So now they call it undocumented immigrant, and they say that no human is illegal and all of this crap, which is like insane reasoning. But for some reason, people who can't think seems to think that this is very impressive, an impressive slogan. But back to your question, like, in what way can we define what too much immigration would be? I'm not sure about that, but it would be something that is threatening the national security. And by national security, I mean the primary premise of the government, which is to protect individual rights. If somehow the liberal order, and by liberal I mean classical liberal order, is threatened somehow by this mass of people crossing the borders, that constitutes a national security issue.
Yeah.
And
Now, for sure, we can get to that. I think the road to get to that is to define immigration, to give it a definition as a value. Because the first step down that road is going to be, what is it about immigration that we like? We have to leave the open border people to the side. And we have to assume that we're going to stop people at the border and check them for diseases, for example. At least, right? A minimum first requirement, make sure they're not diseased. So, what are we going? Why do we want people to come in? Why do we want to set up these posts, check them for disease and stuff? Why do we want to do all that? Why not just close the borders? So, what is valuable about letting these people in? Now, once we define 2 or 3 or 5 things at maximum that are valuable about letting people in, then we'll know what are the boundaries to that value. Like if we want them to come in because we don't have enough workers, okay, so do we want so many of them that it lowers wages for everybody? Like, what's the balance there? And so that's what I think. I think the first thing we need to discuss is what exactly is it that we want to let people in for? Look at Japan; they're not letting anybody in. What's wrong with their what's wrong with their answer?
I think that the discussion comes from the notion of universal rights, universal individual rights.
Yeah.
And we have the notion that I should respect your rights because I want you to respect my rights. And so the notion of like, I don't want to mess with your property because you might mess with mine. It's better to have a system where it's like a tie, like no one messes with anyone else. And I think that there's maybe an idea that has snuck in there that is not legitimate, which is to include immigration in this notion of universal rights. The problem is that there is no such thing as a universal state. We have a nation state, and there are different states. And once you go outside of the state, you're also outside the enforcer of rights within that domain. And so should you then give the same rights to people who are not citizens? Is that why should you do that? Like if we had only one global government, then movement of freedom within that state, global state, would make sense. But we don't have a global government. And in fact, classical liberalism is very skeptical of a global world government, precisely because it's a form of like anarchism at the state level. Like we don't want to have anarchism locally because competing laws within the same geographic region is bad. But we do like the idea of having competing governments around the world that don't interfere with each other. So because if we screw up badly here, then, well, we'll get beaten by the other guys who are more free. So immigration will flow to those places that allow for it. So people are coming to America precisely because it's out-competing all the other guys, right? But in that image of a nation state where you don't have a global government, you can't enforce universal right for all people in the world, including those who are outside of the nation. Like we don't prosecute murderers in Mexico, right? So even if someone is violating individual rights in Mexico or in Peru, we don't do anything about it. Why? Well, we're saying we're limiting the scope of what we will do to individuals to within the domain. But doesn't that also include immigration? Like, why should immigration be exempt from that?
First of all, I want to mention that we do get upset about murders in Costa Rica or Mexico if it's an American citizen.
True.
We get very upset about that. That can cause international incidents like the Warmbier guy in North Korea.
Yeah.
So that, I think, is a beautiful, beautiful thing about our system, that if you're defined as a citizen, we will send an aircraft carrier to this foreign country if there's trouble, you know? If we took that attitude, Americans would be very safe around the world and people would have respect for America. So, so I just want to mention that for what it's worth.
Yes, and but like we do, of course, get upset by any kind of murder anywhere, but we don't get upset in the same way as if it's our own national citizens. No one likes murders or violations of individual rights. But in this context, we're saying that America is not enforcing the law of America outside of America unless it's an American citizen, right?
Which is my justification for not giving the Arabs their oil and keeping it as our oil, because we should be enforcing our citizens' rights who went over there and drilled the oil. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
No, that's a perfect point and example. And but by the same token, like freedom of movement is a right within America for all American citizens. So we do have universal individual rights within the domain of America. That is where we enforce our borders.
Now, you call it freedom of movement, but I have not been able to find that. I've been able to find freedom from unreasonable search and seizure, and I think that is the basis for freedom of movement. I don't know what this freedom of movement is. I never heard about it before the leftist open immigration debate.
Oh no, I heard about it long before that.
Well, we protect against it with the freedom from unreasonable search and seizure. You know, I should be able to move about the country without anybody asking for my papers. Fourth Amendment right.
This was actually something that dates back to, I think, 19th century Britain, when Britain was a feudal state. And you did actually have immigration laws within Britain, because if you were like what are they called? Not the slave, but
the serfs.
Serfs. The serfs were actually attached to a certain geographic property within England, and so you had to have a passport to move out of that property. So within Britain, you had illegal immigration or migration of serfs who moved out of their owner's land into another area. So at the borders of the cities, you actually had passport controls in Britain. And a part of the liberal order that came in the 19th century was the notion of freedom of movement, which was an abolishment of the serf, right? So freedom of movement is a very basic individual right within the borders of a state, because the alternative to that is that you're basically a serf, right? That the only thing that can make us take away your freedom of movement within the state is if we imprison you, right?
Well, if you require a passport to move about, is that imprisonment?
No, actually, like the serf couldn't move about, right? So he wouldn't be able to get a passport.
He was imprisoned in his village, we can say.
Yes.
All right. Yeah, we could say that. And I, you know, but how did they stop him from moving? By requiring him to get a passport or whatever, a license.
Now we call it passport now, but it's today we would call it then it would be some like permit of movement.
Yeah. Now this was true in the 60s and 70s in Soviet Russia. You couldn't go from one city to another without a permit.
Yes, indeed. And you had this also in South Africa under apartheid. And to some extent, you had this in the South until the civil rights movement.
Yeah. Now, so the way I see it is that if we're free from unreasonable search and seizure, that automatically we will have the right to move around without being interfered with. So,
no, I don't see how that follows. You might have a reason behind that, but I just don't get it.
Well, that is the protection the Founding Fathers put in the Constitution that gives us the right to freedom of movement.
Freedom from search and seizure.
Unreasonable search and seizure. Even to stop and ask me for my papers, there's no reason for it. So it's an unreasonable search.
Yeah, okay, yes, I agree. I just missed the word seizure. It just dawned on me. I heard the search part, but missed the seizure. Yes, of course. Unreasonable seizure would be like, well, you can't go there. You can't, like, seizure doesn't mean like literally coming with cops. It can be just putting you inside of a bordered area. Now, imagine if we said that this law applied to anyone in the world, illegal search and seizure.
That's insane. And the second,
that's open borders.
What if we said the Second Amendment applies to everyone in the world?
Yes,
that's open borders. Yeah.
So illegal search and seizure, that's precisely what they want to extend to the whole world. The left, the open borders guys. Yeah. That's what open borders means. Illegal search and seizure, or like no unreasonable search and seizure. So I think it's unreasonable to extend that right, which is limited to the nation state, to people outside. So once you're outside, yes, then we're talking about what's in our national self-interest.
You mean to let people in?
Yes.
The people that are outside, yeah, we should ask what's in our national self-interest. Now, some objectivists are going to get upset about that and say the nation doesn't exist, and that's collectivism. So the way I address that is I say, well, we have elected representatives, and they're going to address the issues that are in the newspapers or whatever they're getting phone calls at their desk saying worry about this and stuff, or universities are making speeches about this. That's how we're going to address these things. It's not collectivist. It's just the way our government works, that we talk about things and address them in law, and immigration is going to be one of the things which we're going to have a body of laws about.
So I completely understand this objectivist flipping out about this notion of national self-interest, which can easily be interpreted as collectivist. So what I mean by that is national self-interest must be firmly based in the individual, not in the nation, right? So we are a nation of individuals, and so it must be in sort of like a common self-interest. Like, I can just take a little detour. It's an interesting detour because many people conflate the term common good with greater good. And it's very understandable. They sound the same, but they are in fact the exact opposites of each other. Common good means it's good for you, it's good for me, it's good for him, it's good for her, it's good for everyone. So it's in your self-interest, it's my self-interest, everyone's self-interest. So common good means common self-interest. That's what common good means. However, greater good means, well, it's not really in your interest and not in my interest and neither in anyone's interest, but there's some greater thing out there that we can't really say. It's in that greater thing's interest, God or the nation or whatever. So that is literally common self-sacrifice. That's what greater good is. So they sound the same, but they're exactly 100% opposite. So when I say national self-interest, you can either think of that as the greater good, the greater national self-interest of the nation, or the common good, which is what we all as individual citizens have in common self-interest.
All right. So if we measure immigration by the common good, then we would say, okay, I have friends and family from around the world that I want to be able to move to America, and I know you do too, so we got to have some level of immigration.
Yes.
Plus, the business owners down the street think wages are too high, and they want some form of immigration.
Yep.
But if we bring in too many immigrants, that'll push the wages too far down. So we've got to for the purpose of the working people, we've got to keep the immigration at some level, and yet we can't bring it too low because the working masses demand their relatives and friends from around the world come to America. So there has to be a balance that equals the common good, where okay, we're bringing in some immigrants and that's helping the labor shortage on the one hand, but we're not bringing in so many immigrants that it's destroying the working class on the other hand. So
yes. Now notice here that we can make an argument for that, very similar to the way Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore argued, because he didn't argue quite like that. He says if the working class or a large segment of the population are going to get angry, dissatisfied, and hateful because of some policy that we're running, then that is going to create discontent, and it's going to eventually create some kind of a national crisis, some kind of a rise of populism.
Exactly, and if we can...
So that's a threat to national security. And the populism is such a huge danger to any nation that if you have a large class of very unhappy people ready to revolt, then that's a danger to the entire Commonwealth.
Now, see,
right?
that's the difference between, that's the common good, is let's not let it get out of control and ruin the working class and lower wages too far. And the greater good would say, well, it doesn't matter, screw the working class, screw all those people, because there are 7 billion people on this planet and they all want to come to America and you have no right to stop them.
Now, notice that the greater good is usually just like a nice term for some tiny little elite, right? Just think about where the term common comes from, or the way it has the two different meanings of common. Common either means we have something in common, or it means something that's very common. It's very ordinary. So the elites refer to the common people as like the ordinary people. And notice what they use this, especially in Britain, it means a common criminal, right? So a common means a lowly person, an uncivilized, a barbarian, someone who's not into the finer things in life and so forth. So to the elite, the ruling elite of the feudal class, back in the heyday, the greater good was which was definitely not common. It referred to something as rare and precious. Think about common metals versus precious metals. So the fine wine of society was the elites, right? The nobility. They were noble, as opposed to those dirty commoners. And in this sense, when they talk about a greater good, they're talking literally about themselves. So if you look at globalism today, who is globalism good for? It's good for the democratic elite who wants to rule the world. So they want to have lots of low-level voters who just create the kind of warfare that is good for them. And it's very good for certain types of very wealthy people who want very cheap laborers, like cheap nannies and all of that, cheap gardeners, and cheap workers to keep wages in check. So it's good for a tiny, tiny group of people in the country, but not necessarily for the rest of the country. Now, at this point, you can argue, as you say, two ways. Either you argue from that this is not good. This is only good for a tiny elite, not for the nation, for the most people, for commoners. But you can also argue that if the commoners get angry, then it's a threat to national security. So you have two ways to go there to argue that there could be some limitations in place. So, for instance, I think that in order to respect all people's possible rights, you can say something like, anyone who comes into the country needs to be able to sustain themselves, right? And they can't have any public goods given to them, like public schools and so forth. They have to fully sustain themselves. Today, illegal immigrants are cheap labor only because they can send their schools to public schools paid for by taxpayers, and only because they can go get social security. I mean, they do this today, food stamps and all of that. I think that I saw some statistics showing that like 70% of illegal immigrants in America receive some kind of social benefits.
Yeah, it's very, very high. And
And that's also true for many of the legal immigrants.
well,
So you see,
I've heard it's higher for some groups than other groups.
oh yes,
The Indians are the lowest of all. They use very little social help.
Indians and other Asians,
South Asians,
like Chinese,
yeah.
Chinese and Japanese, like
Yeah.
South Koreans.
Yeah.
That very, very low. Those receive actually lower amount of social security than whites in America,
Mm-hmm.
generally speaking. No one talks about that because it's white supremacy and white privilege, right?
Yeah.
So, but I, I think that the point here is that immigration should, we can make a case for having very, like, in order to make a restriction on immigration, a very strong case need to be made. And there are always other alternatives than closing the borders. So, for instance, if someone wants to bring someone in here to work, if, for instance, we have a situation where high IQ people come from very poor countries, and they come in here and take low IQ jobs, low skill jobs. What we're basically saying then is that we're creating a permanent underclass of low IQ people or low skill people in America who are citizens, but they are not, they are put behind people who are not citizens.
So you're saying that without this immigration of this kind, some medium intelligent white guy would be running the local 7-Elevens instead of all the Indians running the 7-Elevens, or something like that.
Something like that, because what happens is that if you're only allowing them to come in to work, take the low skilled jobs, what you're basically saying is that the wages of only one group goes down. If you are spreading it so that all the wages go down, well, then you're not noticing anything. That's a benefit to all, right? Like inside America, if all the wages go down, well, no one noticed the difference inside America.
If all the wages go down, presumably
Yes.
that would make everything generally cheaper.
Yes, in America. But you might have to, when you're importing things, that might be more expensive.
So how do we achieve a general immigration? I mean, essentially, I think the 1800s situation was the best. Basically, let anybody come, and if they can't support themselves, they have to leave.
That is the most optimal way to do it. The thing that made that a little bit different back then, first of all, you had no welfare state. Great. Second of all, you had actual low-skilled laborers, like 80% of the population could have low-skilled jobs. You could come there, you didn't have to know the language, and you can get a factory job.
True.
You can't do that today. And so the number of low-skilled jobs are being pushed, squeezed. We're having this constant debate now about universal basic income. And this discussion has been pushed forward precisely because the number of low-skilled jobs available are shrinking. Now, so that is something that we might have to sort of have at the back of our head. But we want to do it in such a way that you do minimum amount of intrusion into the market, because we know that any time we use force of any kind, then something bad happens. So,
I have a litany of arguments against universal basic income. I haven't been able to find any reasonable arguments for it. I think it's socialist utopianism.
yes,
We've
that wasn't my point. My point was that we're having that discussion now because
okay.
of the shrinking amount of low-skilled labor. Of course, universal basic income would be a bad solution. There are many much better solutions than that. But as of now, that discussion is becoming a reality precisely because self-driving cars, for instance, if it ever becomes a reality, I'm a little bit skeptical actually, but if that became a reality, there's that's one of the largest jobs for low-skilled people in America. Uh, what that's being a driver, right?
Yeah, that's true. And the gig economy has moved a lot of people over there for through Lyft and Uber. It's a lot of people that do one thing and then they go take a couple people in their car for a little extra money and then they go do their regular job. A lot of people do that.
Now, I'm actually very skeptical to both Airbnb and to Lyft and to Uber and all of that, because for I don't mind them. It's a good innovation, but few people understand that Lyft, Uber, and Airbnb, they are signs of poverty. They're signs of poverty.
Yeah, I think so. Everybody should have their own vehicle. They shouldn't have to share a vehicle among 20 people.
Now, the way I discovered this is because when I was in third world countries, I've been to a lot of third world countries, and what I found there is that sharing is the norm among poor people. The poorer you are, the more you share. So inside of a house where people are very poor, then 10 people are living inside a tiny little place. And when they're driving like their motorbikes, there are 10 peoples on the motorbikes. They're sharing. Uh, it's quite funny to look at that. When you have these the jeepneys or the tiny little buses that they have, people are sitting so tight that they're really sharing this thing.
And what comes to mind also is in Russia they had one bathroom and 4 apartments on that floor, and everybody
Yes.
on the floor would share that one bathroom.
So sharing is a sign of poverty. And so we should never ever say that this is a great step forward for mankind when we're starting to start sharing things. Like if it would be a step forward if no one ever needed to have Uber because like they had magic cars and
yeah. If everyone could afford cars were affordable on any decent wage, you could get a new car like it was in the 60s and 70s, then you would say, why don't you just call someone else to come pick you up? And you'd say, that's insane. Why would I wait here for someone to pick me up? Why not just take my own car?
That's right. So sharing in general is just a sign of poverty or lack of wealth. And I see this. The first thing people do when they get more money, apart from actually the first thing they do is to eat more. They go to McDonald's. That's the first thing they do. But after they do that, they get their own phone. They don't share it with anyone. They will have their own phone. And they get their own car. They don't share it. And they get a nicer and larger house, so they don't have to share bedrooms, not 4 in one bedroom. So the first thing that goes when people get money is sharing. That goes away. And just like the direction of immigration, you can tell which country is freer. You can tell from what people choose, what kind of activity represents poverty and wealth. And people try to flee away from sharing whenever they can.
That's true, yeah.
So sharing is poverty economics. I just wanted to bring that in so that, yes, it's great with Uber, it's wonderful with Airbnb, but it actually does represent that some kind of poverty that is spreading in America and in the world.
Yeah.
And yes.
I had thought of this before. I thought this Uber thing and this Lyft thing is popular because there are a whole bunch of poor millennials who can't get together enough money to get their car payment, but they can get $20 on a weekend to get them home from the bar. So that's
Yes.
what's really going on. Is it's a bunch of people who don't have. And the sad thing is, the people who are running these cars, they're getting some cash, but I've done the numbers on it, and I don't think they're getting paid for the wear and tear on their vehicle. So I think that they are pumping money upwards. I think everybody in the situation is pumping money upwards, and it's kind of sad.
I think you are probably right on that. I haven't done the exact numbers on it, but it wouldn't surprise me at all. Uh, because like if you are unemployed and you're just sitting there and have nothing to do at night, I mean, uh, why not go out and have a low wage job? Uh, because if you can drive and talk to people, it's so for some, if you're willing, one way of thinking of it is it doesn't pay for wear and tear. Another way of thinking of it is you're not getting properly paid. You're getting a minimum wage, like $5 an hour, something like that.
Yeah.
When you can't take into account the wear and tear, uh, and that's quite possible. So I just wanted to bring that into the sort of debate about universal basic income and just self-driving cars and all of this. We're now seeing a sign of stagnation in the West. We should be we should be on moon bases. We should be going to space like that. We should have flying cars. We should have private jets, right? That's where we should be at. We shouldn't be talking about like recycling plastic straws. Uh, that's the wrong conversation. That's a sign that we're going downhill, right? Um, so, but in relation to immigration, uh, what I'm seeing is that we there are ways of solving immigration without closing the borders. You can just put in place certain nudges that makes things like semi-closed. So, for instance, in Singapore, they haven't closed the borders, but they have instead closed certain uh, professions from immigrants. So you have to be a Singaporean national to be a taxi driver.
Oh yeah, that's right. I remember you mentioned this in our one of our first talks. Yeah,
Yes.
that's an interesting system, and for Singapore, a very small island, it would probably is probably possibly even reasonable. Of course, we all know that the government usually does more damage than help when it tries to help. So I wonder what the real consequences of that are. But how would we apply that to America? What would we say that if you want to work for minimum wage, you have to be a citizen?
Well, something like something like that. Well, um, um, uh, I do know that in Singapore they were worried about how the wages were pushed down. So they say that in order to be able to work in Singapore, they have put a minimum wage for the immigrants.
Oh, for the immigrants.
Yes.
Oh, so to work for less than the minimum wage, you have to be a citizen.
Yes.
Nice. Well, that's interesting. Then I'm tempted to look at it as though we're importing, letting immigrate some overlords, only people who are above us in the economy.
No, that's not what is happening in Singapore. Singapore is letting in nannies and things that Singaporeans don't want to do, like that. So they do have the lower class, so to speak, but no one wants those jobs in Singapore. But they do want to be taxi drivers, and they do want to have their street restaurants and family restaurants and all of that, like the small family businesses. They really like that. Um, but mostly it's high skill immigration. But at the same time, Singaporeans are patriotic. So even if you come there and try to get a job from the outside, many of the companies will say that we only accept Singaporean applicants. And they are not required by law to do that. They're just patriotic. or for some other reason think that this is what we want. It doesn't have to be patriotic. It can be something as simple that it's less paperwork.
Right. Yeah,
Uh,
Japan definitely has that. China has the opposite of that. They don't like Chinese people. They'd rather hire a foreigner.
yeah, that's right. And there's a good reason for that, because most things that are purely Chinese, unfortunately, suck.
Yeah.
Uh, and this is not me saying that. This is the Chinese saying this.
Yeah. They're the one. They're the one. That's the claim comes from them. They're the ones that want to hire foreigners because
Yeah, and
foreigners are
they'll only
better.
buy foreign goods. Like if you're driving a Chinese car, that's a sign of poverty in China. You need to buy a European car and have a European watch and whatever. Then only then can you be accepted as a truly rich and noble person
Yeah.
in China.
Yeah.
So now we're talking a lot about how to limit immigration, but as you were starting out by how can we act to make or keep immigration as a value.
Yeah.
And I think that we're starting a little bit in the wrong end by saying how can we limit immigration. There are a lot of things that we can do before we talk about that. If we got rid of if we say that welfare only applies to citizens.
Well, let's not say limit. Let's say maximize. How can we maximize immigration? Because what do we want from immigration? We want value. How do we get the very, very maximum amount of value out of immigration?
That's a good way of looking at optimizing it.
Yeah, optimize immigration. What do we do to optimize immigration? Now, maybe we do a survey. The government does a survey every year and says we have somewhere between 20 and 50,000 open jobs, and we're going to accept immigrants for this reason. Or this year we have 2 million open jobs. We're going to accept a whole bunch of immigrants this year. Maybe that's the path we go down. But in some way, our virtue would be the ways in which we make immigration valuable.
Well, one way of doing this is if like if an immigrant is able, like if you come on a tourist visa to America, and then you're there and you say, "Hi, I'm really good. Can I apply for a job?" And someone accepts you at the job. If you actually have a job offer, that's a pretty good, decent application for immigration, right? Why should we stop you from coming in if someone actually wants to have you in? It should be a very good reason for that. And like, I'm talking about, I understand this notion that we're pushing down wages and so forth. As you say, any kind of government interference is going to probably have negative consequences. So we want to minimize that. And I think, therefore, that before you start doing those kind of internal nudges to the system of like trying to incentivize or disincentivize inside the country, it's better to start with just saying that in order to be able to come and work in America, you can't just receive a single dime in America.
Yeah.
of public welfare. And not only that, there should be an even stronger requirement. If you come here, you should be required to pay for some kind of medical insurance, a minimum kind of insurance. So that if you have to go to the hospital, you will not die in the streets and so forth. It's like a minimum requirement insurance. So then you're actually erecting a tiny little like cash barrier, and that's possibly enough to protect the lower class.
All right, so require health insurance for immigrants.
Oh.
That's an interesting, maybe that should be the only requirement. Once you buy health insurance, you can come in. Oh, no welfare state. You can't get any help from the government, and you have to find a job.
You don't have to find a job.
Yeah, I was going
You
to
have
say,
to
what if you
pay.
have relatives? You can live with
You
relatives in America.
you can live in America. You can sustain yourself. So, for instance, there are several ways of coming in. Either, for instance, you show that you are able to pay for your own stay, like like for instance, if you're coming in as a tourist, you should have a return ticket, right? That's a normal requirement. If you want to live there in America, you should either be able to show that you have a certain amount of money in the bank, or you should get a sponsor in America that is vouching for you, saying we're paying for this guy.
Yeah, I think those are reasonable. Health
And
insurance, health check, and basic monetary competence. Or
yes,
sponsor, which is
and
monetary competence.
and no welfare check.
Mm.
Now that is going to probably stop most of the very low skilled workers from entering. In other words, all the jobs that normally people who are trouble having jobs in America because they're low skilled, they would not have to compete with all the smartest people from bad countries for low skilled jobs.
Now that's going to make agriculture less efficient and more costly. That's going to make poultry processing less efficient and more costly. Because right now we have these really hardworking immigrants working for very low wages in those jobs.
But notice that that is a very special kind of job. Those are called seasonal workers.
Yeah, that's true. The farming is done, well, it's done more year round in California and Texas, but is generally seasonal for the whole nation. Yeah. So what are you saying? We should have seasonal immigration?
Well, in all countries I've heard of, there there's a concept of a seasonal worker. So, for
We
instance,
used to have it. California used to be flooded with Mexicans during peach picking time.
yeah,
So we used to have seasonal immigration.
yeah, and so I don't see any problems with that. Like, and the question is like, are is uh, American farming going to go bankrupt because you have to employ very expensive American labor, or should you allow for them to have access to cheap Mexican labor? I think that I'm not against a farmer is not like a rich globalist, right? So we're not talking about a snooty elite here having a cheap gardener and nanny. We're talking about a farmer is a family business often, right? And there's no reason innately to limit them. I mean, how many of the low skilled people in the world, in America, like to live out in the farms out in flyover country?
Yeah, very no. Everybody's leaving for the cities. Everybody lives in the cities and suburbs. Nobody lives out in rural country.
Yes. So I don't see actually that as a big problem. I mean, if people really wanted to work on these farms, that would be different. But there doesn't seem to be any like uh, American desire for working on the farms. So it's like in Singapore, nanny. No one wants to be a nanny. So there's no restriction in Singapore for nannies from other nations.
So maybe we're going to have the industries apply to the government or tell the government how many jobs they feel like they have open each year. Or maybe we can do it like you said, just check at the border and say, do you have gainful employment lined up? And the people with gainful employment, we can let them go through. And
I
we
the,
might even require employers to pay some sort of bond or something like that in case the guy doesn't show up for work and just disappears out into the United States wilderness or something like that. But, anyways, go ahead.
that's one thing, but like having a very bureaucratic system of people reporting how many jobs they have available, that's sort of like turning the whole problem on the head, because you should say that unless anything else is stated, immigration is not a problem. So it should be the other way around. That once you start noticing a huge problem in one area, then you might say, in that particular area, we might have to look at the immigration rules. So instead of everyone reporting in, you saying, we're zooming in on a specific field where there are issues, and maybe that field have to make some like reporting or something, because that's minimum amount of force, minimum intrusion, rather than having everyone say.
Okay, so just leave it open until we see a problem. So
yes,
in what sense do we leave it open then? Just let people come in.
We just had those requirements we just said.
All right.
You have to not a single dime from the government. You need to have health checkup, like proof that you're healthy, and that you have a health insurance, life insurance kind of thing. And if you're coming in on a tourist visa or a short-term visit, like a seasonal worker, return tickets.
Right. Or if they're coming across the southern border, they don't need to return ticket. But
no, yeah, that's true.
But so to enforce that, we would need to stop you from getting any help from the state if you're not a citizen. And we would also have to dismantle the welfare state as such. Even if you became a citizen, you couldn't get any help, so there wouldn't be any incentive for those people to come here. I mean, that I think is really the most important thing. We need to restrict border crossings until we dismantle the welfare state, and then I think a lot of these things will solve themselves.
Yes, and today, like, I think that you're not going to get people on board with dismantling the welfare state for American citizens, but you can get a majority on board for dismantling it for immigrants.
Yeah, but that's the least we could do. The first step.
That is actually realistic.
Yeah.
And if you have this thing that your new citizens in America cannot be entered into the welfare state. Like if you're an immigrant, now we're making a new deal, which is if you come here as an immigrant and become a new citizen after a certain like date, like 2021, then yes, you can become a citizen, but you can never ever be eligible for Social Security or anything like that.
Only people born here are eligible for it. Why? Because they didn't pay in? I mean, that sounds fine, but I don't even want the Social Security system around anyway. So.
I know, but here is if you have a system now where you're saying basically that immigration washes away Social Security, that's good, right?
Immigration washes away Social Security. I don't know what you mean by that.
Well, you're getting new citizens, but those are not getting Social Security. So when those others, when you have more immigrants from that group, those are outside of Social Security. So the amount that will get Social Security is a shrinking amount.
Well, I like that. That's a policy idea I hadn't thought of. No, that's a detailed policy, but it's an interesting idea.
Now you're turning around the incentives because the immigrations are paying into the tax system, but they're not benefiting from it.
Right.
So now you're having them on board saying, wait a second, I really don't like the Social Security thing. I'm not getting anything from it. It's only those other people who are getting from it.
Now, don't you think eventually they would want to have that reversed so everybody gets Social Security, or you think that would push it in the other way and try to do away with Social Security?
Well, it's possible, but if you have a system where the people who came here are self-selecting based on productivity and the attitudes that come with that, that's what we really want, like a filter, a reality filter. That's actually probably a force for good on average. So those people who have lifted themselves by their own bootstrap, they're probably not the kind of people who are looking for social security benefits. They come here to value freedom, and they have actually tasted the whole enchilada of freedom and responsibility. So the point is, like, instead of looking at where we can making restrictions, like make any policy that we can create at the border, that's where the restrictions come, at the border, not inside. That is good. So if we just say that like any immigrant, he comes from outside from America, doesn't get public welfare of any kind, including public schools. That alone just, bam, solves 90% of the illegal immigrant issue.
Yeah, and that also bites at the heels of the whole issue, because that's the whole thing the Democrats are running, is a scam of here's a bunch of benefits and that's what's getting them to come. That's the whole reason they're coming. So, yeah,
precisely.
We need to do away with welfare benefits for immigrants. We don't have to dismantle the entire welfare state immediately, but to do away with welfare states for immigrants as the first step is a very, very reasonable goal.
The point is that it's 100% unrealistic to dismantle the welfare state for everyone. That's just, you're not going to get that tomorrow. But we are in a situation now where 50% of the population or more could be willing to dismantle the welfare state for immigrants.
Yeah.
That can happen tomorrow. This can happen under Trump's watch.
Yeah, that would be an interesting move. We should definitely start getting it out into the, start having it talked about. Dismantle the welfare state for immigrants.
And notice how this optimizes the value of immigration. We're saying we're not getting any of the bad immigrants now. We're just getting good immigrants. What's bad about that?
It increases the value of immigrants to us.
Yes. And who's against that?
Now that would be defined as a virtue according to the definitions. You know, Ayn Rand said a value is that which you act to gain or keep, and a virtue is the means by which you act to gain and or keep it. So it would be virtuous of us to do things which make immigration a sturdy long-term value to our country.
Yes. And I think we've identified some of the ingredients. I mean, it can be hashed out and refined and so forth. But getting rid of public welfare for immigrants, very good first step.
Yeah. Yeah, in principle, we do want to move towards freedom, away from government control of the situation. And so, and that little piece of government control is like the keystone right now in bringing the immigrants in, is all the tens of thousands of dollars we're waving in their face if they just come. So, well, all right, I think we've covered the subject. Shall we draw a line here and plan towards Sunday for our next chat?
Yep, that sounds good.
All right, thank you for joining me, Onar. I'll be putting this up today or tomorrow, so watch for it.
Talk to you soon.
All right, bye-bye.